In her path-breaking book, Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk, theologian Dolores Williams offers a provocation to theological discourse by rereading Genesis' Abraham narrative through the lens of Hagar, the slave and surrogate of Abraham and Sarah. Challenging a biblical hermeneutic that constructs a notion of justice centered on the ideal of liberation, Williams opts instead for a Hagar-inspired praxis of survival in the wilderness. The ideal of liberation for Williams cannot do justice to the lives of black women who, like Hagar, are from the outset not positioned as the proper subjects of liberation. In the biblical narrative, it is the descendants of Abraham and Sarah who come to be the liberated people of God who inhabit the promised land. Hagar, by contrast, is not liberated into a promised land. Instead, she flees into the wilderness where her freedom from surrogacy is lived not as a triumphant achievement, but as a precarious practice of survival. God does not give her salvation as a member of the liberated people of God, but rather survival in the wilderness. Williams uses her reading of the Hagar narrative to pose critical questions to theologies that idealize a salvation that is produced through a logic of surrogacy. Surrogacy, broadly speaking, is the operation of producing a future by instrumentalizing some aspect of the present. So you might think of biological surrogacy, but it can be all the different kinds of surrogacy. In the case of American slavery, slaves' bodies and labor became the surrogate sites of the production of capital. And capital, again, in all sorts of kinds of ways, was a mark of salvation, the liberation of the American colonies from British rule. America is birthed as an independent, free, self-sustaining nation through surrogate labor. For Williams, however, one cannot, without problems, turn to Christianity to generate a critique of surrogacy, and thus of slavery, because at the heart of the Christian narrative is a moment of divine surrogacy, God sending his Son to take the place of sinners and win them salvation through his sufferings. Jesus is a divinely appointed surrogate, which for Williams entails a deeply problematic sanctioning of the logic of surrogacy and its subsequent operation throughout Christian history and tradition. Christianity easily becomes the discourse of a future salvation based on an instrumentalization of the present and its sufferings. The present and its sufferings are not allowed to speak for themselves, but are surrogate sites for the production and reproduction of a future. And for European colonial Christianity, the Christianity we inherit and continue to pass on, this always means a white future. Williams opts for a Christianity without surrogacy, which for her means a Christianity without the cross as a site of redemptive suffering. A Christianity that does not hold out a promised land of salvation won through suffering, but a Christianity that gathers around Jesus as God's presence with us in the wilderness. It is a Christianity of fugitivity and survival rather than a Christianity of salvation. I begin with Sisters in the Wilderness as a way into thinking critically about the notion of justice and the kind of theological and ecclesial labor we might be asking it to perform, or about the kind of labor we are asking ourselves to perform in the name of justice. Just as Williams poses critical questions to the discourses of liberation, asking who is the discourse of liberation for, and who gets to decide what liberation is, so I want to pose critical questions to our own discourse of justice. Who is the discourse of justice for, and who gets to decide what justice is? Being the bearers and custodians of a European colonial Christianity, we at the center of the Church, of course, feel authorized, justified, and compelled to generate discourses and visions of justice. It's our colonial duty. What, after all, is the point of the Church if it doesn't center its own vision and practice of the common good? In a post-colonial age, this of course has to be done sensitively and inclusively, with the right amount of what Saidiya Hartman in her book Scenes of Subjection calls liberal sentimentality, which is the emotional bread and butter of good white liberals. Amen. What I'm interested in thinking through is how such sentimentality and the discourses of justice it generates, those of inclusivity, multiculturalism, multiracialism, equality, reconciliation, charity, and institutional progress, in short, the discourses of liberal humanism, are sites of what might be called the afterlife of settler colonialism, which is colonialism living on, in and through and by way of our well-intentioned efforts to upgrade our discourses and institutions. Colonial institutions like the church rarely, if ever, engage in radical self-critique or self-abolition, but they are all the time seeking to upgrade themselves in order to ensure their future, and therefore the future of the colonial project. What is characteristic of the times in which we live, especially the last 40 years or so, is how institutional upgrade trades off of sentimental moral rhetoric. Companies and institutions can hardly market themselves without some appeal to justice. So you think of fair trade coffee, right? It's an obvious example, but there's a million other examples in which the moment of capitalism intersects with the moment of justice or morality. The desire to upgrade discourses and institutions, to make them more open, flexible, tolerant, hospitable to complexity, suspicious of top-down hierarchy, more organic, is at the heart of what many today are calling neoliberalism, which names in part the inseparability of capitalism from sentimental moral discourse, or sentimental justice discourse. Neoliberalism is colonialism rebranded as capitalism and dressed up with sentimental moral rhetoric. And it's a sentimentality that works to anesthetize us to the ongoing structural violences that continue to shape every aspect of our lives. It is the brilliance of neoliberal capitalism to hide these structural violences from view by getting us to feel good about some affective investment in justice, or some cause of justice. Saidiya Hartman includes even outrage at horrendous acts of violence as part of the repertoire of liberal sentimentality. Feeling outrage at photographs of lynched black bodies, or their 21st century equivalents, YouTube videos of black bodies being gunned down by police, while of course an absolutely necessary response, can work to create an emotional investment in the spectacular nature of visible violence that leaves the slow burn of structural subjection uninterrogated. Likewise, feeling a kind of pride or satisfaction when once excluded identities take up positions of visibility in colonial institutions can be the performance of a deep emotional investment, not so much in the lives of those once excluded, but in the future and viability of the colonial institution itself. Dolores Williams calls it surrogacy. Let me turn to a recent global spectacle that stages precisely this kind of emotional investment. I'm speaking, of course, of the recent royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Here at the very center of white colonial Christianity, in Windsor's St. George's Chapel, a black woman became a princess. Accompanied by a gospel choir, a black cellist, and a black bishop who preached on love's ability to overcome division by appealing to the faith of slaves, Meghan's entrance into the royal family staged a beautiful and hopeful scene of reconciliation, not only between white and black, but also between Christianity and politics. In a time when an obnoxious and ugly form of Christianity in America continues to support the presidency of Donald Trump, it was a breath of fresh air for many to see the possibility, or to see a different side of Christianity's power to aestheticize and sanctify a political moment. I have no interest in denying the beauty of it all or the enjoyable nature of the spectacle. But as always, it is necessary to stay suspicious, especially when dealing with white colonial Christianity and its institutions. Let me quote here at length an analysis provided by the theologian Amoria Shea Armstrong. She writes this: "The royal wedding was a case study in just how second nature Christianity's redemptive narratives are for dramatizing the reconciliation and overcoming of the divisions that the political engenders, leaving the status quo intact while producing the feeling that things have changed. Episcopal Bishop Michael Curry's sermon, with its emphasis on love, especially how black slaves experienced God as a source of love, worked as an effective boost for such a narrative. Black people, collectively represented through the bishop, the gospel choir, Meghan's mother, the black cellist, are no longer slaves, but children of God, children of the Western world, providing a challenge to those many white faces and institutions represented in St. George's Chapel, the heart of white colonial Christianity. What they provided was a more beautiful story of the gospel and what can be when love weaves the enslaved into a tapestry from which they are all too often left out. But there is a level of hermeneutical violence that is required to make the enjoyment of black people in spectacular situations equivalent to black overcoming or subversion, black radicalism and authenticity, black freedom or liberation struggle. Similarly, the lengths to which some are invoking enslaved people as props to recuperate royalty as a concept are disturbing, as though Meghan's entrance into the royal family proves something about blackness being worthy and dignified, when what it really proves is something about the whiteness of the world in which we still live. The enslaved are not an emotional tool in a redemptive narrative. They did not exist to give a story about love overcoming all odds a boost when folks are feeling low or scared because Trump is president or because of Brexit. They were people with lives and imaginations that we can never exhaust. Given how slavery is an institution that desires to exhaust their persons by making them produce meaning for a white supremacist world, again, surrogacy, it behooves us to find ways to talk about them, how we are students of them and inspired by them that aren't predicated on forcing them into meaning for us either, or for exhausting redemptive narratives, whether it's in the name of love and hate. We have to do justice to the enslaved by trying to give them the dignity of being worthy of attention and study simply because they were, not because of who their descendants are, not because one of their descendants is now a princess. Their existence does not find meaning in us. There is no narrative, no matter how beautifully robed in royalty, that can redeem that violence, and it is high time that we stop trying. That's Moria. The point here is to bring to light how easily Christianity stages scenes or narratives of redemption that appear to heal or reconcile the very antagonisms it created, all the while depending on those antagonisms to ground the performance of a seemingly benevolent and inclusive sovereignty. And so at the end of the day, the antagonisms are still necessary and operative even as they are purportedly being overcome. Black lives are still being made the surrogate sites of white sovereignty and meaning. The sentimental inclusion of blackness within whiteness operates within the claim to sovereignty that whiteness is. And Christian theology, with its drive toward redemption and reconciliation, is the perfect narrative to hold the spectacle of such sentimentality. It is the perfect narrative to hold it, but it is the narrative that birthed it for the modern world. But what if the violence and injustices of the past cannot be redeemed for us here in the present? What if they stand in judgment against the coherence of every story we are tempted to tell about ourselves, against every narration of the church or the state as that community that embodies the redemption or repair of history? What if doing justice to the disaster of history means refusing any sentimental redemptive take on history? As Amoria Armstrong puts it, what would it look like to practice the use of theological and artistic materials without reference to a sovereign story, and thus without reference to a sovereign claim of freedom or hope or belonging to ourselves or another? What practices of attention can do justice to the flesh, the black flesh that pays the cost for the redemption of the West within our imaginations, without converting it into a meeting for a common sense of freedom or liberation, without a common in mind, but an undercommon sense of the unsovereign? Or, in Dolores Williams' words, what would it mean to do theology and church in the wilderness rather than in the promised land? And by wilderness, I do not mean the secularization that displaces the church from the center of cultural and political influence. Secularization is not the wilderness, because secularization, the West's secularization, simply carries on the logics of the Christian Western world in all kinds of ways. The wilderness is where Hagar flees to escape her surrogate position, her inscription in a redemptive narrative, whether sacred or secular. The wilderness is outside the bounds of the polis. It's outside as well the bonds of its sociality that ties Hagar into subjection. In the wilderness, what one wants perhaps is not so much social justice, but rather justice on the social. That is, the justice that refuses the social in the name of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey called the undercommons, which is what Amoria was referring to. Those who flee into the wilderness do not want to be alone, not at all. What they want is ways of finding each other, touching and caring for each other that the social is set up to prevent. As Jack Halberstam puts it in the preface to Moten and Harvey's book, The Undercommons, If you want to know what the undercommons wants, what black people, indigenous peoples, queers, and poor people want, what we, and the we who have at the space of the undercommons, want is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be broken apart. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down the structure that right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know lie outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn shit down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. Our goal, and the we is always the right mode of address here, is not to end the troubles, but to end the world that created those particular troubles as the ones that must be opposed. And so, as theologian J. Cameron Carter puts it, what if our sense of justice gives us a desire not so much for reconciliation or even liberation, but rather for abolition? Reconciliation as a project of institutional upgrade and cultural upgrade is meaningless for the bodies at the bottom of the Atlantic, or for those on this land who were slaughtered at the hands of settlers or ripped from their parents' arms. We ought never to think that we can reconcile ourselves to that suffering. So what if the goal of what we call reconciliation, and I'm thinking here very concretely of projects like Reconciliation Australia and its ecclesial manifestations, is its own undoing as a project of and for white colonial institutions like the church and the state.
Amen.
Insofar as reconciliation remains a white project, it cannot be anything other than sentimental. So what if the horizon of reconciliation is not a better world, not an upgraded white world, but rather the end of the world as we know it? As Carter puts it, the object of reconciliation might have to be the decolonization of the world that was built through theft of land and labor. If the kingdom of God has come means something like that, Christianity has a gospel to preach.
Amen.
Thanks.
Hey.